These are Ruminations from Among the Bards. I am Christopher Lewis, and this evening we're going to talk about the ancient wisdom. To comprehend the incantational power of a story told in well crafted verse, one has to enter into the incantation because only there will all the secrets of language be revealed. Because language is a creative fire. This is what we've forgotten, and this is what poetry recalls. This is what we call upon the muses to help us recall. But to enter the invocation requires a prayerful state of mind and a reverence before the wisdom of the ancients. This is what characterizes our wise ancestors is a reverence towards what is venerable and sacred. How do we approach the great epics of old? With respect and with a willingness to be taught that which is most important to remember. Then the pages open for us and reveal their mighty secrets. But without experience of becoming immersed in worship, in which the noetic faculty is awakened and illumined by divine radiance, it is hard to see very far into the minds of our ancestors. But if we can gain an appreciation of the kind of knowledge they thirsted for. And even if it was incomplete in many ways, even if their worship was flawed, it was better than our agnostic preoccupations and mumblings in the dark that we take for granted as enlightened observation. And so let us see if we can try to open the world of the ancient epic tales. And to do so, we have to see the cosmos as they saw it and their place in the cosmos. But to find our place in their cosmos, I think everyone will agree that we need a little commentary. And so we will rely on some of the commentaries of modern scholars. We might approach their commentaries with a slightly different slant. My view on classical literature and poetry was formed many decades ago when I read the commentaries of Father Seraphim Rose on the progress of Western culture and thought. And his was essentially the point of view that the philokalia that we've been discussing, forms the height of the discernment of wisdom and the illumination that comes from a relationship with, as its name implies, the love of the beautiful and the good. Father Seraphim Rose was critical of the direction of Western thought that it has taken in the second millennium of our history. But his criticism was positive. He maintained an appreciation of what is beautiful in artistic and literary endeavors. And though Father Seraphim's guide to the philosophical underpinning of Western thought still has not been published, Father John Strickland has given us as good an assessment in 4 books on the periods of Western thought. I believe this is the 3rd book on the Age of Utopia. He calls it The Rise and Fall of What the West Once Was. So that's a good series of books to take a look at. Some of Father Seraphim Rose's writings have been published, pieces and sketches. He gave his talks at summer conferences at Platina Monastery long ago. And here is one of the books that's been published of a period in thought. This is the place of Blessed Augustine in the Orthodox Church. And there are theological problems with St. Augustine that Orthodoxy takes some issue with. And he's fair in his assessment of those problems. He has a positive view of St. Augustine overall, and he doesn't want to remove him from the role of the saints. but there are some severe imperfections in his thought. And while we're on that topic, Father Seraphim Rose himself, by the time that he died, he was still actually pretty new to Orthodoxy in some ways himself, only a few decades, and not all of his thought is perfect, and he made some mistakes. But we don't necessarily expect for um, any of our holy fathers or saints or teachers to be perfect. Another good book that's been published is called Nihilism, and it's a discussion of really modern philosophy in the current world, and what terrible effect nihilism has taken on the mentality of Western thought. And then finally, this is a very, very old copy, Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future. This is an assessment of New Age religion from the point of view of Orthodoxy. Um, so this is the way that I'm going to view Western literature and thought, beginning at the very beginning. But I'm going to try to do it with the greatest respect. And so let's take a look at the really old wisdom tales. How old are the ancient epics? We don't know. The Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, come from the time before Homer, probably a long time before Homer. They refer to a vast body of literature that was familiar to his audience, including all of the ancient myths of the gods. And so it is very, very old material that he preserved for us. Oral lore existed before writing, long before writing, so it's impossible to say how old the oral traditions are. But we can be certain that they were already very ancient by the time they were written down. The oldest epic that we have is Gilgamesh. This is the oldest text that we know of in existence. And we have fragments of this on clay tablets in Old Sumerian, which is not even an Indo-European language. And these began to be written on the clay tablets as long ago as perhaps the beginning of the second millennium before Christ. So we just don't have any other texts that are that old. But I don't want to talk about Gilgamesh yet. We'll get to that later. The biblical writings are younger than Gilgamesh as writings, but the oral tradition is also so old it can't be measured. And of course, the biblical writings share the same background, the same oral background as Gilgamesh and its mythology. And after all, these were the tales and the lore that Abraham brought from the ancient city of Ur. Other ancient epics that we know are all far older than the written texts. And so I want to open a discussion on the antiquity of human culture and the importance of lore and story at the foundation of culture. If we look at what we now know of humanity in the ages before writing began, when memory was of primordial importance, what has been discovered in recent decades of archaeological work is that mostly discovered in the Eurasian steppes and around the Black Sea, but also in Africa, there was a very high sense of culture that existed long before the rise of the first cities. This is very well put together in this book. This is pretty much a foundational study in our time, The Horse, the Wheel, and Language. And it goes back as far as archaeology has been able to assess. And we know that this high culture consisted of village life at the beginnings of agriculture very, very long ago, and that there was a great cultural revolution that was settled agriculture that led to village life. And this period lasted for a long time, perhaps thousands of years. And it was an age of fine pottery, fine basket weaving. Late Stone Age houses sometimes were timber structures with finished and painted clay floors and walls as beautiful as any of the early fine ware that are still being dug up from long ago. This village life was very old and well established long before the first great metropolises began, and it's these first great cities that we used to assume was the beginning of civilization. But we see now that high culture existed long before and long before writing. We see in it the mark of advanced, intelligent humanity far back in time. These were the ages from which the oral lore descended to us. It was an age of culture, of weaving, planting, sowing, observing the stars and seasons, raising herds, making tools and boats, and all the lore that goes with these inherited skills. This is what we call culture, inherited skills that have to be learned from the elders. And we would do well to honor that memory and take a fresh look at the old stories that see far back into time, before the beginning of history as we know it. And that's why I want to talk about the Mahabharata of ancient India and the Popol Vuh of Central America. And these are just two, but the old stories are everywhere. And it's really the great gift of the Romantic era, the late 18th and early 19th century, that led to an awakening of interest in antiquity and the recovery of old lore that would be lost otherwise. Now, if you ask me, how do I reconcile these vast cultural or even geologic ages with the limited timeline presented in the biblical narrative? I will say I don't try to reconcile them in any way, at least not in that way. I don't try to force the biblical narrative or any other into my understanding. It's better to begin by respecting the lore and learning from it. I don't try to argue away modern scientific research. I value research, but I accept it within the limits of its own paradigm. And I don't assume that it explains everything, that scientific knowledge is the sum of knowledge, and we have to dismiss everything else.